Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, July the 22nd, 2025. We've done lots of shows about books criticizing religion, lots of shows about books criticizing money, but we don't seem to have done a book which combines the two until today. A book called The Almightier, How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin is out today by my guest, Paul Vigna. He is joining us from the great state of New Jersey. Paul used to be at the Wall Street Journal, former reporter there on money, written lots of books about money and crypto, so he knows what he's talking about. Paul, is this new book, which is out today, congratulations, The Almightier, is it a critique of religion or a critique of money?
Well, really, Andrew, I'm not thinking of it as a critique of either, quite frankly. I'm thinking of it more as an explanation of in some ways, both, but certainly money. I kind of try to make it clear in the book that I'm not criticizing money. I'm not criticizing the system. I'm not criticizing people who want money. Because the argument I make is that we all need money. We have kind of built our society around money, and we have built up the problem is that we've built up a mythology around money, and that's what I'm trying to break down there. So I'm sure some people are going to read this as a criticism of money and read it as a criticism of religion, and people can interpret it however they want. But my goal was not to criticize those things. I don't see this book as a criticism of those things.
Speaking of money, Paul, you're a historian in some ways. This book is a history of money, a history of value. Comes with a great blurb from Simon Johnson, who just won the Nobel Prize, who was on the show last year talking about his book on innovation. Has there always been money since we've had human beings? I assume there's been such a thing as value, but when can we trace money back to?
Well, the interesting thing is we don't know exactly when money was invented. The documents, no one has a document where there's some person in the ancient world saying, hey, I just invented this thing called money. It's pretty handy. You might want to try it out. What we do have are documents going back about 5,500 years or so. And that's the first documents that we have found that discuss money. What's interesting about it is that those are also the first documents we've found that involve writing. So, you know, as much as we have a recorded history, which is going back about 5,500 years, the first thing that people were talking about that we know of was money. So money goes at least 5,500 years back. How much further it goes back than that, I don't exactly know. Nobody exactly knows. We'll probably never know. But it's really interesting to me that money and writing and the rise of the first sort of large-scale civilizations all occur around the same time. And I think those things are connected. I mean, you can make the argument that writing came about as a necessity because they were using a sort of proto money and they needed a way to keep track of it. And what they came up with was writing, basically. So long-winded way of answering your question, Andrew, is I don't know exactly how old money is. Nobody does, but it goes back to at least as far as we have any kind of written records for.
So, Paul, I appreciate your honesty. You suggest that we're not entirely sure, but the origins of money and the origins of writing go hand in hand. They're bound up with one another, probably hard to separate. I've always assumed, as a layman on these things, that the invention both of money and of writing reflect the birth of civilization, because our species go back way more than 5,500 years. Isn't that the standard narrative, that the invention of money, like the invention of writing, reflects a higher stage, shall we say? I know that's a dangerous word these days, of civilization. It reflects a step forward, to borrow some language from NASA, step forward for mankind, that we were, especially when it came to money, we were sophisticated enough to trust some sort of symbolism of value. Is that the standard narrative on the history of money?
Yeah, and I think there are two things. Before I even get into the answer, Andrew, I do want to point out that I am not a professional historian. I am a professional writer, and I was a journalist for 25 years. And as part of that, I was always sort of curious about history and the backstories to things. And in covering Bitcoin for about 10 years, I started becoming interested in the backstory of money. And that's how I sort of fell into all this.
Right. You
But
wrote,
I'm not a
I was familiar with your Age of Cryptocurrency in 2015, and then
right.
the
And
Truth
Truth
Machine,
Machine.
Cryptocurrency, the Future of Money in 2016, and then another Truth Machine in 2018. So you're all too familiar with the concept of money, especially when it comes to crypto.
So yeah, I just want to state that I'm not a professional historian.
But you're more of a professional than I am, Paul. So you do a much better job.
But to answer your question, humans have been around for a couple 100,000 years. Homo sapiens for a couple 100,000 years. Human society, you go through the archaeological record and you start seeing, 40, 50,000 years ago. I'm sorry, 40, 50,000 years ago is when you start getting Homo sapiens. I think if I get the numbers wrong, people don't, crush me on this. Like I said, I'm not a professional historian. My point is that you started having Homo sapiens before you had large scale civilizations. And even 10,000, 15,000 years ago, we have found that we found them in Turkey and other places. We have found small scale but permanent civilizations. People were building small towns and they were building temples and things like that. And you do have evidence of civilization before you have the written record, which is about 5,500 years ago, which is what I was talking about. And that is around the same time that you do start to see large scale human civilizations, the first real cities. And to your real point, where you're really going with this, Andrew, I think it's very fascinating that around that same time, you see the emergence of money. And I really do think that money as a tool, and I think this, too importantly, money as a tool is a valuable thing even today. And this was sort of a trick that I faced in trying to write about this, is to not make it too critical, to not just have this be a condemnation of money, because money is actually a very valuable tool. And what you see in the historical record, you look back and you start to see these cities emerge, and you start to see them using money as a way to keep track of their resources and as a way to know who has a claim on those resources. And it was a very handy tool. And I really think that helped fuel the rise of the first large-scale civilizations.
But it still remains a very useful tool. Your book's out today, The Almightier. It's in Barnes & Noble and Amazon. If I walked into Barnes & Noble with my cow or my horse or my wife and said, I want to exchange one of these for the book, they would look at me as if I'm insane. The reason why I'd be able to simply buy your book, Paul, again, you don't need me to tell you this, is because we agree, we trust each other. They trust that my money, whether it's in cash or in a credit card, maybe even eventually a Bitcoin, is trustworthy.
Right.
And I hand it over and they give me the book in exchange. Isn't that essential, not just for our civilization, it goes without saying, but even for any kind of complex civilization? And in that sense, what's wrong with money?
Well, and this is the thing, you're right. If I walked into Barnes and Noble and I showed them this, right?
And
it's only
Paul is
$1.
waving a $1. It costs more than $1, I hope.
Right.
Paul.
It costs more than $1, but I'm waving a dollar bill in front of me.
Right.
If I walked in with a dollar bill or a $20 bill or a $50 bill, whatever, and exchanged it for my book, I could do that. That'd be great. If I walked in with this, and now I'm holding up my little notepad that I have here, and I wrote down $20 on a piece of paper and handed it to them, to your point, they'd look at me like I'm insane. But here's the question, Andrew. What is the difference between the piece of paper that has, George Washington's face on it and the piece of paper that I just wrote down? What's the difference? They're both pieces of paper. So the question is, why does one piece of paper have value, recognized value, and why does the other piece of paper have no value? And when you start thinking about that and you start digging into that, that's when you realize what money is.
And I come back to the T word, Paul, which I know you cover in the book, and you've done a lot of thinking about trust. I'm doing another show actually dedicated to the crisis of trust in the 2020s, maybe not so much financial, although it's an institution, certainly in political terms. But isn't money, or the invention of money, essentially about trust? There's that person in the Barnes & Noble, you and that person, you both trust the coinage, so to speak, although that's the wrong, it's not
No, you're right.
of the Federal Reserve, or of the American state. So you trust that they can take your dollar and use it for something else.
Yeah, it's funny because when the opening anecdote in the book is about FDR and the Great Depression and his very first fireside chat, in which he uses these words, faith, trust, confidence, in talking about the banking system and the monetary system, which had collapsed in 1933, early 1933. And you wonder, like, why did he use those words? Why were those words important? And here's the thing, to get to your point. If money was a real thing, if money had an objective existence, if money was like a tree that could be cut down and turned into wood that could be used to build a house, or oil that could be taken out of the ground, refined, and used to, power my car outside. I could go down the line with every commodity you can think of and explain the uses of it. If money was like that, there would be no reason to ever talk about trust or faith or confidence. There'd be no point in it, because everybody would understand what the value of it is. When you look at these situations, every time you have one of these sort of hyperinflationary economic collapses, the one common thing that you see people writing about later is that people lose faith in the system. They don't trust the money. And so they demand more of it and more of it and more of it to get the same goods. And you end up with this hyperinflationary spiral. And it comes down to what you're talking about. And the reason that it comes down to what you're talking about, Andrew, is because money isn't real. Money is an agreement among people. When you're talking about trust, we're all trusting in this system. It's a system that we all buy into.
There may even be the word trust on your $1 bill. I'm sure if you read it out, it would say something about trust.
Right. Yeah. It says, "In God we trust," which is even more telling if you really think about it.
Well, I don't know about telling. It's telling for your book, because you're talking about how money became God, greed became virtue, and debt became sin, which is very much of an American subtitle, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. That subtitle was a group effort. My editor, my agent, myself, we all kind of worked on that.
It's like an American car, right?
Yeah, right.
Subtitles by committee. You got to be careful about that.
Yeah, exactly. But this is kind of what I'm talking about. Money is not its own, does not have an objective existence. Money is a system. Money is a thing that we created. And the question is that I try to explore through the book is, why has it come to have such value to us? And why has it come to be the thing that sits at the very center of our society and around which everything else revolves, and has become our prime incentive? Why has it become our prime incentive system? Why is money the one thing that everybody needs and everybody wants? And we can get into it, but that's what the book is really trying to explore.
Let me ask again. Excuse the naivety of this question. The book is called "The Almighty: How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin." I don't actually believe that money is central in our society, in our culture. It's value, and especially you're the crypto man, so you know how, I don't know, crypto could be thought of as almost post-money. What's the difference in your narrative and in your argument between how money became God and wealth became God? I take your point on wealth, but I don't, excusing the pun, buy it on money.
Well, wealth and money are obviously, at this point in the world, they're very similar things, right? One represents the other. Well, let me put it to you this way, Andrew. I'll answer your question with another question. How long do you think you could last without money in Silicon Valley, in your society, in your
Money being
no, no, really, like,
that dollar
let's
bill you
say,
waved at me, or wealth?
no, no, money. Like, let's say your bank went under and there was no FDIC, no deposit insurance, and you lost it all, and someone came in and robbed you, and you had no money. You had no money and no means of getting any more money, so you couldn't buy anything. How
Well, there are
long do you think?
many. I don't know where's the last time
How long do you
tourists
think
came
you could
to
live?
San Francisco, but there are lots of people on the streets like that. So I could last a long time. It probably wouldn't be a lot of fun.
Probably wouldn't be a lot of fun, and you certainly wouldn't last as long as somebody who has a lot of money, who can afford health care, who can afford the best of everything. So, I don't know, man. I think money is
Well,
extremely
money's
essential. I
important,
think
but
money is
yeah.
extremely essential.
So in terms of your narrative, obviously there's a huge history of writing on capitalism, on money, on value. My
Mhm.
favorite book on it is Weber's Protestant Ethic, which suggests that our fetishization of money came out of the Reformation and our uncertainty in the eyes of God. So money signified not necessarily being saved, because you couldn't determine that, but gave us a little bit of confidence. Um,
Max shows up in my book, by the way.
Good. Well, he
Yeah,
should do. He should show up in
yeah,
everyone's book.
right.
But so I take your point that there is a connection between money and God and virtue and greed and all the rest of it. But I mean, what's I mean, maybe we can get to the alternative later. But aren't you stating something completely obvious, that everyone's a bit greedy and that we live in a society which is unequal? Some people have too much money, some people don't have enough. We live in an age where, I don't know, whatever it is, 10 wealthiest billionaires own the 50% of the wealth in the country. I mean, when did
Well,
money become God? What's your point
sure.
in the book?
So I think if you say to a lot of people, money is like God today, I think a lot of people would probably say, oh yeah, sure, that's kind of, on a figurative level, they would accept that. But I don't mean it on a figurative level. I mean it on a literal level. What I argue in the book, and I go through all of history to show this, although it's not that long of a book, don't worry, it's not like a 5,000 page book. I mean it in a very literal way, that money is a product of religion. It was invented in temples in 5,500 years ago. It has been seen as a product of religion. It has been seen, it's holding it, having it has been seen as a sign that the holder has God's favor. And in the modern world, where the idea of God and gods has kind of fallen away from the center of society, money has stepped into that vacuum. Money has replaced religion as the thing around which we all strive for. That's more or less the argument I make, and I take the reader from ancient Mesopotamia up to the modern age to show how that happened.
So is this capitalism? I mean, the history of capitalism is, of course, bound up very much in the history
Yeah.
of modern
Yes.
money. Are you suggesting that capitalism has made money become God?
Uh, I don't know. I would say that. Well, I would say capitalism is part of this, obviously. Um, and I think, to your point about inequality and capitalism and greed and all those things, the point is, are those things natural, or are those things a result of our beliefs? I think there are some people who would probably argue that we'll always have the poor, we'll always have inequality. That's just society. You can't help it. You can just kind of try to get along with it. I argue something very different. I argue that the belief system we have built up around money is directly responsible for that. I think if you look at any society, and especially today, money is essentially a way to distribute resources. And economics really is just a system for distributing resources. And money is a claim on those resources. And what has happened is, because we have this sort of belief, I don't know if I'm not going to back up. We'll come back to it though. But just accept for now that we have this belief of we equate money and God in a very sort of subconscious way. Because of that, you have had the pursuit of money, the pursuit of wealth become an increasingly larger focus of society, to the point where the whole idea, the original idea of distributing resources, has actually faded away. No one really, does that except for as a way to make money. And making money has become the middle of our world. It's what everyone wants to do. It's what everyone cares about. Even if you are not an Ivan Boesky, Bernie Madoff type, real greedy person, just to live, you need money. I need money. You need money. I'm not giving my book away, Andrew. I'm selling it for money.
Yeah, but you could say we need food. You haven't written a book, How Food Became God. Greed
no, because
virtue.
we don't.
Cooking became sin.
Worship food.
What?
Well, maybe some people worship food, but food is more important. Food is more important than money.
Of your
I'll
book,
say that.
The subtitle, as you say, created by your committee at St. Martin's. How money became God, greed became virtue, and debt became sin. Isn't the reverse true, especially when it comes to debt and sin? Isn't in the pre-modern age, debt was sin? There were debtors' prisons. It was considered evil to owe. These days, I mean, to answer your question about how long I could survive without money, in San Francisco and in the United States, I could actually survive surprisingly long, because I could probably get some credit cards without even having any money. So coming back to debt, isn't debt anything but sinful, or is, at least in contemporary capitalism, isn't the heart of American capitalism the idea that debt is a good thing? It's good to gamble. It's good to borrow.
It is today. It wasn't 100 years ago. It wasn't 150 years ago. I mean, there really was a time where having debt was seen as a bad thing. So that is an attitude that actually has changed. But let me ask you this, Andrew. Yes, there is a huge moral component to debt. Why? Why is there a huge moral component to debt? And one of the things I talk about in the book is that when you have money, I guess this is where we should back up, and I should sort of explain very briefly how I trace the history of this. So money shows up first time about 5,500 years ago in ancient Mesopotamia. It is a product of temples. The temple in Uruk is where we find it. And the temple scribes developed this system to keep track of the temple's possessions, which is called money. And in those ancient city-states, it's important to realize that there was no separation of church and state. The church was the state. The entire city was built around the temple, literally and figuratively. The entire goal was to please the gods. Money was part of that system. And in that respect, if you had a debt, you basically owed that debt to God, to the gods. And if you weren't paying that debt back, you were thumbing your nose at the gods.
I take your point, and I don't mean to stop you talking, Paul, but you keep on using this word money, and to me, what you're talking about is property, ownership.
No, it's a very subtle difference, but it's a real difference. Ownership is a thing. Wealth is a thing. Possessions are a thing. Money is the system that represents those things.
Right.
That's it. Money is
not its
own thing.
It's the symbol of your property.
To be a thing that represents these.
But coming back to ancient Mesopotamia, if to be punished, you didn't have your money taken away; you had your property taken away. So they're hard to distinguish, actually.
Yeah, I mean, look, obviously they're very similar in some respects, but.
Okay, well, go on with your narrative. I keep on interrupting. It's a fascinating and very controversial one, which is why it's an interesting conversation, but go on.
So you're right. In those times, if you got yourself into debt and you could not pay those debts, you would have your possessions taken away. You'd have your farm taken away. You'd have your freedom taken away. You'd be sold into slavery. So there were very, very real penalties for it. But to my point, and to what the story I'm telling, is that what's important is that from the very beginning, there was this money and religion were intertwined. The two were very similar. Well, not similar, but they were related. One came out of the other. And that has sort of been around money for the entire history of it. And you talk about Max Weber and his argument, you start to see, and I talk about the 1400s in Europe, and you start to see this change, but I'll jump ahead even a little further to get to that exact point. In the Protestant Reformation, you have Martin Luther leads this big rebellion basically against the Catholic Church, which had become hugely powerful, hugely rich, and hugely corrupt. And everything the Catholics do is terrible. They're awful people. They're all going to hell. They don't look at God. They don't understand how to worship God. It's all wrong. And you have the Protestant Reformation, and you have people like John Calvin. And it's interesting that, and you see it most clearly in Calvin, they don't condemn having money. They condemn decadence. They condemn immorality, but they don't condemn money. And in fact, they turn it around. Calvin says, God controls everything. Every single thing that happens in your life at every second is happening because God wants it to. God is all powerful. So if you have money, you have it because God wants you to have it. Therefore, if you become rich, God wanted you to become rich. And therefore, in Calvin's theology, you should work hard to make a lot of money. You shouldn't spend it the way the Catholics do. You shouldn't do that with your money. You should use it for good things, but you should work hard to get money because that's what God wants. That idea gets transmitted and transmuted, and eventually it comes out the other end through Adam Smith as his metaphor of the invisible hand. That everybody who has money has it because they're supposed to have it. There is an invisible hand directing us. So it becomes a secularized idea. At that point, it emerges, and actually I argue in the book that capitalism emerged a few hundred years before that, but at that point, what we think of today as capitalism emerges. So that idea is baked into capitalism at a very deep level that I think most people, to get really, really back to your original question about don't people understand this, it gets baked in to capitalism as an idea that is under the surface. And I think most people don't actually understand that.
Yeah, and coming back to this idea of debt becoming sin, I mean, where we are in Silicon Valley, when we look at societies which struggle to replicate Silicon Valley, it's often because it's very hard to borrow money. It's very hard to realize debt. But that's another question. Yeah. How does your argument, the Almightier, Paul, compare to Marx's critique of money and capital? Because it sounds like in some ways you're saying the same thing, except you're not building a kind of a revolutionary narrative in the way that Marx did.
No, I'm not. I think it's kind of similar, and Marx is another character who shows up in the book, obviously, and not obviously. Marx is another character who shows up in the book. I don't think really broadly. I don't think Marx was quite as focused on the religious aspect of it as I am. I think even by his time, it had kind of become so sort of baked in that it wasn't what I'm
coming back to Marx, didn't Marx in Capital see money or critique money in a metaphysical sense and argue that before the revolution, we always mythologized and turned money into a metaphysical thing. And it's only after the revolution that money or value or property would become real, maybe because we'd get rid of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I think another thing is Marx advocated for a post-money society. He wanted to get rid of money. I'm not arguing for that. I'm not saying we should get rid of money. I'm saying we should, I guess, sort of like knock money down a couple pegs, see it more as a hammer and less as a god. I guess that's one way to put
Yeah,
it.
it's interesting.
So we're different in that sense.
Right. Thinking out loud about your point, you say that money or wealth has become the defining quality. And maybe you're right in that sense. We think of ourselves in those terms. But when you go to your cocktail parties in New Jersey, or certainly when I go to mine in Silicon Valley, people ask you what you do. People ask you if you're married. People ask you where you went on your holidays. But nobody, not even the rudest of people, and I consider myself pretty rude, will ask the first question, how much money do you make? Often we're thinking that. Especially in Silicon Valley, are you a VC? Are you an entrepreneur? Why are we so, if your thesis is so right, if money is indeed God and blah, 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 and it's become the almighty, why are we so polite about it? Why don't we just get straight to the point? Americans are very good at getting straight to the point. And when they first meet each other on a train, on an airplane, at a cocktail party, the first thing they say is, well, how much money do you make?
Well, I mean, look, there's obviously some kind of social etiquette around it that has developed over decades and centuries, but while nobody would come out and say, how much money do you make? Money do you make? What they will do, Andrew, as you're pointing out right now, is they will size you up, and you will also sort of display how much money you have, what kind of shirts you wear, what kind of car you drive. Nobody needs a very expensive luxury automobile, but people buy them. Nobody needs to buy a very expensive luxury shirt when a cheap shirt would do, but they buy them. Nobody needs jewelry. No one needs a gigantic house. That's all the things I'm talking about. So
that's true in New Jersey. Excuse me.
Yeah, it's true in New Jersey.
Cliche. I'm not sure it's true in San Francisco.
But
in fact, some of the
to your
wealthiest
point,
people.
we may not come out and say, hey, how much money do you make? But we are sizing each other up. We're asking questions that get at that. And we are also sort of, like a peacock showing our feathers to kind of show off how much money we have. And it's all very under the surface, but it's all very much there in every conversation, in every interaction. Even people, I guess in Silicon Valley now, it's kind of like, now your thing is now the real sign of wealth is you wear a hoodie and a t-shirt. You're so rich.
Lots of people on the street also wear. I take your point, but lots of people on the street also wear t-shirts and hoodies, so you can't tell the difference. And often the street people of San Francisco look cleaner and more refined than some of the very wealthy. What about the history of organized religion? We've done lots of shows on evangelicals, Paul. What's the connection between, shall we say, modern American capitalism and the modern American evangelical movement, which often are connected, and they seem to particularly connect in our age of Trump?
Yeah, I didn't write about that, Andrew, and I thought about writing a chapter about it, and I didn't, because I was trying to keep the book at a short enough level that it wouldn't seem like some kind of opus, and you'd get I want to write one of these books that people talk about but nobody actually reads because it's too long. So I didn't write about that subject, but I think they're clearly related through history, because the church was a very powerful institution. And I talk about the Middle Ages in the church, and sort of how the church ends up embracing this, what I call an ethos of beneficial greed. There's a whole point in the book where I talk about how greed, how the attitudes towards greed changes. And the church actually becomes part of an institution that embraces that change. So the church and money are very closely connected, and you can see it. This whole idea of this gospel, the prosperity gospel, it's a complete fusion of the two. So, in some respects, that does exist, and that's, frankly, in my opinion, a problem. In some respects, it doesn't. I'm not out there saying every single person who is a religious person of faith, whatever that faith is some greedy, money grubbing, whatever. Some people are very earnest in their beliefs and in their faith and in their morals. So it's not a complete combination of the two. But yeah, I mean, look, you can see it in certain religions, in certain areas of it. certainly your televangelists who go on there all day and say like, oh, just praise God and God will make you rich. Okay, sure, I'll try it.
Although, some Christians will, of course, remind us, like Pete Weiner, that a lot of the Bible focuses on money lending, the evils of wealth, and actually makes poverty a virtue. But that's another subject. As I said, you've written a number of books on crypto. Donald Trump, the so-called Trump pump, has embraced crypto. How does crypto fit into your narrative? Is it an extreme manifestation these days of how money became God and greed became virtue and debt became sin?
Yeah, I think and again, crypto is another thing I thought about writing a chapter about and ended up not doing it.
You're probably sick of writing about crypto.
Yeah, but I mean, crypto, especially Bitcoin itself, you can absolutely see how Bitcoin is a religion to some people, to a lot of people who are in that world. Bitcoin is absolutely a religion. It's got its own God in Satoshi Nakamoto, its creator in Satoshi Nakamoto. It's got its own
abstract God,
genesis.
because we're not entirely sure if that person is for real.
Well, I would argue that God is not for real, but that's
that's
another thing.
In that sense,
yeah, it's got its creator, it's got its genesis moment, it's got its Big Bang. It has a lot of, and actually we do talk about this in the age of cryptocurrency. So if you want to go back and see it in that book, it's in there. Crypto is very religious. There is a fervor around it. It's a money religion. It's a complete money religion. They believe that Bitcoin is going to be the future, even though, what is it now? It's 2025. So what are we? 15, 17 years after it started operating. No one's really using it for anything practical. No one uses it as money.
I mean, would you call it money, crypto? I mean, would it be? I mean, your subtitle is "How Money Became God." Is crypto money, quote unquote, money in your narrative?
Crypto could, well, and here's the interesting thing: crypto could be money. Again, to my point, money is just a representation of resources, a representation of wealth. So anything can represent those.
Right. But the reason I keep
resources.
on asking you this is because you have money as the almightier in your narrative. Finally, yeah. Paul.
But, no, wait. It's interesting, the whole Bitcoin thing, because the thing about Bitcoin that's interesting is that when it was worth nothing, there really were a lot of people that said this could be money. This could be the future of money. And there are things about Bitcoin that are very, very interesting and efficient. The way that you can have money trade hands anywhere around the globe in a couple of minutes. I mean, it's an efficiency. It's really interesting. As soon as Bitcoin started becoming valuable, you saw this whole to use a word you use, this fetishization of it rise, and this whole sort of religious fervor take hold. And it is the most fascinating thing to watch, because it really is. You saw a religion grow up around a monetary system. So in my mind, Bitcoin is actually a complete illustration of what I'm talking about in the book.
Yeah, and that fetishization, as he said, Marx dealt with it very well in Capital. Finally, Paul, fascinating thesis, interesting conversation. You're obviously very well versed in all this. Everyone's going to be saying, yeah, there's probably some point to what he's saying, but what's the alternative? And I know you do deal with alternatives. What is the alternative to what you entitle in your new book, The Almightier? What could we do better? Can we live without money, without wealth? Are you a socialist, a communist? What are you arguing in favor of? It's clear what you're against.
Sure. Well, I think, and look, I'll frame it this way. One of the reasons I wanted to write the book, one of the reasons I think it's important to sort of talk about this and for people to kind of take a step back and think about what money actually is to us, is because today we live in a world where we literally, and it's not hyperbole, we could provide the basic, we could provide the basic needs for every single human being on the earth we could grow enough food for everybody, we could build enough housing, we could provide electricity, we could provide healthcare, education, all these things, which is the entire point of society. It's the efficient distribution of resources from people, everyone in the group. We could do those things. And that wasn't true 500 years ago. It wasn't true 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Technology that we created has created these advances in agriculture, advances in healthcare and medicine, all these things. We are at a point where today we really could provide everything for everybody in a very fair and equitable way. And what I say is we don't do that. We don't even think about doing that. And the reason we don't do that or think about doing that is because we still have this deeply embedded belief that money is God and that we are chasing money. We are not chasing the thing that society is supposed to be set up to do, which is just to help people survive on this planet. And I kind
You sound like a bit of a Christian, Paul. I mean, it's a classic Christian critique of capitalism, which is ironic given that you're also against religion here. I mean, if you like that, go and live in Denmark or Sweden. But America is for innovation. People in America, and people will make this argument, you want 3 cars, you want a big house. What's wrong with that?
And look, I acknowledge, and like I said at the very outset, Andrew, I didn't really write this as a critique of money and of the system. I'm not trying to criticize it. I'm trying to explain it and make it clearer for people so that we can start building the kind of world that I was just talking about. And if somebody wants to come up and call me a socialist, whatever, I don't really care. My point is not to criticize it, not to say we need to tear down capitalism, we need to tear down money. My point is to say that the system could be fairer and it could be balanced. And that word shows up in the book a few times, balance. It's all about restoring balance. And I do point, the last chapter is kind of some ideas for restoring that. Some of it's very practical stuff. Some of it's very pie in the sky stuff. But I think the one thing that to me would be most important would be that the shift, there should be a shift of what's at the center of our world. And I think right now, money is at the center of our world. And I think what should be shifted to the center of the world are people and their welfare. I mean, what else is society for if not for that? And I think that is, and look, I understand also that you're talking about a huge sort of philosophical shift in how people think. Like you were just talking, you were just spouting this sort of stereotypical US capitalism, rah, rah, rah thing. I get that is the pervasive ethos of the country. This isn't going to change. It may never change. But that's what I think should change, is I think we need to have a shift where people are more important than money, and taking care of people is more important than accruing wealth. I absolutely believe that.
Fascinating stuff from Paul Vigna. His new book, The Almightier: How Money Became God, Greed Became Virtue, and Debt Became Sin, is out today. Congratulations, Paul. Can I charge you for this interview?
Yeah, look, I got $1 here for you. Is that good? Is that enough?
That's enough, Paul. As always, wonderful to talk and fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, and best of luck with the book.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me on.